Natalie is an emergency relief and recovery specialist with experience in long and short-term disaster responses. Originally from Texas, she started her career as a consultant engineer after graduating from Texas A&M. Soon after, much to her parents' dismay, she sold everything and left Texas in 2017 to work in a refugee camp in Lesvos, Greece, during the Syrian refugee crisis. 5 years and many emergency responses later, she returned to support refugees and internally displaced persons during the unprecedented Ukrainian crisis via access to medicine and mental health care. Throughout her career, she's worked a series of positions with nonprofits and non-governmental organizations, both domestically and abroad. Her focus has been on coordinated logistics, operational support, and project management in natural and complicated disasters. Her year revolves around the hurricane season in the U.S., preparing and ensuring essential facilities have temporary power during outages. She continues to highlight and respond to the needs of refugees and those affected by disasters. She works to bring dignity to all humans in her local community by supporting refugee settlement in East Tennessee and is on the board of Bridge Refugee Services. I hope you enjoy this quick time with Natalie as much as I did. She's got a lot to offer, and I learned a lot. So I hope you do too. Get mad. Stay blessed.
All right. Brothers and sisters, welcome again to another opportunity to learn something. So as you all may know, it's Refugee and Displacement Month. We are trying to learn and engage with all things related to the terrible crisis of over 100 million people around the world being displaced, both internally and externally, asylum seeking, and all the stuff. Today we have with us Natalie, and as you heard a little bit from her bio just before this, we're going to just dig right in. And Natalie, I guess we'll start and go ahead, and even though they heard from your bio, give us a rundown of kind of what you're doing now in Poland.
Sure. As you know, I work in emergency relief and recovery and am currently on a response to the Ukraine crisis. This particular response, we are working both in and outside of Ukraine. Just a quick distinction, refugees are individuals who have left their home country. Internally displaced persons are people who are continuing to remain in country, but have had to move due to, a variety of factors, but in this case, aggression or violence. So in this role, I work with a team that supports medicine security and mental health and psychosocial support of both refugees and displaced persons. So one of our primary components is ensuring medicines and medical supplies get to where they're needed in Ukraine, as well as ensuring that the mental health and health access of individuals, both refugees and displaced persons, are being taken care of as best as possible. We know it's a huge need. And so working with implementing partners and our technical experts and technical team to not only improve outcomes there, but also just to improve knowledge in Ukraine and bordering countries.
Yeah. So currently where you're at in Poland, it is those people are in refugee status because they are coming into Poland from the Ukraine crisis. And even I was just shocked at the growth number from the current conflict, because in my original video, we talked about the 84 million, which is still the number that UNHCR shows, but like just that, that was from last year. Already we've increased by over 15. And so I guess I'm curious, I kind of want to hit on the mental health. That really fascinates me, because one thing that I feel is common in a lot of other cultures is mental health is not a focus, or like even here in the States, it's like finally becoming less taboo and more discussed and solutions for people that are struggling with it. And obviously, our brains as humans are not meant to undergo so much stress for such a long period of time. And so someone who's in that position where they're leaving their home country, clearly there is mental health, but what are people's like reception to that idea of like working through it? And what kind of processes do you guys develop for working through things with refugees?
Sure. I'll say it's complicated.
Yeah, I know,
as I'm sure you can imagine, this is not an easy answer. And there's a lot of work and technical experts that go into this exact question. And I will say I'm not a mental health expert. I work in team operations and logistics. So I'll give you what I know. But in general, any kind of crisis in someone's life affects their mental stability. And in normal operations, like normal daily life, you're affected, you feel your emotions, and you kind of come back down to normal status, right? And when you're living in a heightened emotional state and you are unable to regulate your emotions back to that normal baseline, that's when we start having long-term issues. And that's that's when you get to clinical diagnosis of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and those kinds of things. And those do take a little while to not only be able to diagnose, but to make themselves apparent. So thinking about refugees, and specifically in Poland, that have come from Ukraine, are living in Poland, are dealing with a variety of issues, not only basic needs, right? So that's a first intervention of actually mental health, that ensuring individuals have access to basic needs, because how can you better your mental health if you don't have shelter, you don't have food, you don't have water, right? So you can actually characterize that as one intervention. Another intervention is more community resilience based. So thinking about how we are engaging with the community on a larger level to greater support themselves. So you think of a group of Ukrainians, for example, who are here in Poland. Have they been able to connect with each other? Can they share their own stories? Can they, as themselves, create their own community groups? Can they create a variety of not only places where they can share their emotions, but just look for childcare, share job information, share shelter information. And so this kind of community resilience is actually a type of intervention that allows a community to become better resilient and address their own mental needs. And now above that, we do have kind of different interventions. Maybe a intermediate after that would be more specific, what I would consider group therapy. But again, I'm not the expert on that. And then the highest tier is what maybe we think of traditional mental health support, which would be counseling, therapy, one-on-one sessions, psychology, maybe a medicine intervention, and things like that. And so when an individual is coming into Poland, who's dealing with all of these pieces, we as humanitarians or as individuals who want to support them need to address all these levels of interventions. And maybe, we can't address every single Ukrainian refugee with clinical intervention. And the reality is that's hopefully not needed. And it's likely not needed because many people are able to regulate themselves back down to a normal baseline emotional state, right? And so that clinical is then for those individuals who are unable, and we can support further with what we know. And a lot of that kind of knowledge comes from past refugee crises. As you mentioned, we are now over 100 million displaced persons. So as an organization, this isn't the first time that we've dealt with this, but it is the first time a lot of maybe Polish psychologists have, or even Ukrainian psychologists have. I think that's a really unique place, actually, is our Ukrainian refugees who are psychologists who are dealing with their own emotional refugee crises, and they're actually have turned around already and are responding to their fellow communities. And they're building interventions from a variety of levels, right? So being able to intervene on a one-on-one clinical setting, but also on a community level and being able to build a basis of resilience. And so bring in, technical experts that help to create either programs or interventions or trainings to build different modules that we can actually deploy into civil society is where we find our niche and our expertise is, best place to deepen the impact. As a reminder, Ukraine, Poland, bordering countries, they're quite developed. They have amazing civil societies. They have nonprofits. They have NGOs. They have functioning government institutions that are actually working to address these factors, right? And so when we think of emergencies or refugee crises, we think everything is broken down, but the reality is it's not. And so we're actually here just to lift up these existing institutions and provide them better knowledge to address the new concerns, right? The feelings that have been created by the violence or the need to move and the displacement themselves. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about a little bit about the stigma that we here in the United States have, is it something that, of course, we see very much not only in people who are moving, but in a variety of aspects. I will say, similar to the States, people are addressing it in a new way. The acknowledgement is there. It's a lot stronger. And I think when we look at different interventions of mental health support, some of them are a lot more accessible. The being able to just talk about your feelings while you're getting, a food distribution or a non-food item distribution, that's actually an intervention that's really important because it allows someone to express their feelings and also then regulate their own feelings, right? And so that stigma is, if we're looking at the different types of interventions, is being able to make all of them available. And sometimes it doesn't feel like therapy, and it shouldn't, because we build our communities and our support networks that help us get through the day. And those things don't need to have stigma. They very rarely do, but sometimes they need a little push to be built back in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I generally sometimes wonder if the reason why we struggle over here so much with it is because we don't have as much community built in from the way our culture has kind of evolved. I'm curious. So walk us through kind of the process of conflict and people then fleeing. And there's this in-between phase that I think maybe a lot of people, and even myself, very ignorant of, unless you go watch a movie or something, but that kind of in-between before actually getting resettled somewhere, if that's the end goal, and kind of that in-between, which I think commonly people would be known as like camps or refugee camps. So what's that process look like? And is that currently like what the situation is in Poland? Are they actually like set up official camps? And what does that kind of look like for someone who's fleeing a conflict, whether it is directly next door, like Ukraine to Poland, or maybe they have to skip a few countries and go up, from Sudan to Egypt, or what does that process kind of look like? And what's that experience like for them?
It's never the same. It's never the same in each crisis or even each country. Your nationality and where you're going is a huge factor. And a lot of this actually gets into legal distinctions, right? So a receiving country first has to make a legal distinction that someone is a refugee and that they're not just seeking asylum, that they're seeking asylum rather than immigrating, right? And those are two different legal distinctions. But you don't have time to go through these legal distinctions when your safety is in danger. And so you leave, right? And the receiving country has to figure out what to do with you. And as someone who responds to emergencies, I was in Greece during the Syrian refugee crisis. And at that time, the response was actually to put people in refugee camps. Now, this is common. It's used in many different crises around the world. Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar has a massive Rohingyan camp as well. There's several in Africa that have been around for ages. I think one of the longest refugee camps is over 60 years. And so this is kind of something that's been built, but at the same time, actually the average time someone spends in a refugee camp is 20 years, which is not the goal of a place for people to stay while they're legally processed in the system, right? And so as a community, we recognize that these places are maybe not beneficial, not only to individuals when we think of their mental health, being stuck in one place without legal status, but without the safety to go home. That's a huge issue. And so it does look different in every crisis. I will say that in Poland, for example, they responded with open arms. The amount of, response just from the people to the government has been really inspiring. The government essentially said anyone who comes in to Poland from Ukraine after February 24th is free to stay here for 18 months. Which is a really rare occurrence, right? That gives them the legal ability to not only find work, but access resources that they might not have had access to, which then allows them to become better productive members of society, or even have their own resources to go back home or continue supporting in that way. When you put individuals in a refugee camp, because they haven't had a legal distinction created, right, then you take away the ability of someone to generally find work, to generally build a community, to generally build a life. We recognize these happen because people are there a long time. So you can look at places that have been around a while and people have, built their own lives and worked towards that, but in a way that the system is not made to support. And so in that period, right, that's where you have asylum seekers, people who are looking for safety. And the legal definition of where they are and what country they're from, and if the receiving country has even defined that crisis as having refugees. And then you have to get to the next level of proving to a receiving country that your life is in fact in danger. And how can you look at, people and say, okay, show me how your life was in danger. I mean, to me, it's unreal. But as people wait, they do have to wait somewhere, right? And so we recognize that I'm not going to solve the legal issues of asylum seeking or even fix the way that we respond to refugees or asylum seekers in the United States, or even immigrants for that matter. These are really broad issues that are very emotionally charged for a lot of reasons. But in the interim, I think there is something that we can do as humans is support individuals who have gone through something horrific, something that has caused them to leave their country, right? And now they're stuck without status. And that place of lacking status really leads to a lot of insecurity and instability in their lives. We talk about mental health. Right. What is the best thing for your mental health? Have that kind of security. Know that you're legally allowed to be somewhere, right?
Right.
I remember in the camps in Greece, people wouldn't exit the gates of the camp because sometimes they could be heard to be picked up by border police, despite the fact that they're living on an island and they literally can't leave it. And so it just creates these restrictions and restrictions on restrictions, and people sit there waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting. And then they, as far as needs go, then you have to provide all the needs as best you can anyway, right? Food, clothing, water, shelter, all these things, because you have people living in a place where they can't create their own communities or create their own needs or access needs. Then as a humanitarian community, right, we want to support as best we can. And it ends up with these systems that just, in my opinion, of course, perpetuates the problem of people who are there. I think there are some really great examples of integration into communities. And I haven't worked in this crisis myself, but in Colombia and Venezuela, we've actually seen a very unique response. In the 90s, there was a massive migration out of Colombia due to a lot of factors. Right. And actually, a lot of them were received into Venezuela as they were culturally similar. They, were considered migrants at the time, and they were received into the society and built their own lives. Now, 2 decades later, when Venezuelan government collapsed and Venezuelans were actually seeking refuge, they went across the border to Colombia. And there they were also received. And now it was a massive number. And at that time, we actually had more structure as a humanitarian community to support, but they were able to seek work. They were able to seek status, legal status, and able to build communities. And also they were culturally similar, which makes things generally a lot easier. We see the same here in Poland, where Ukrainians and Polish are quite similar, have similar values. It makes that integration process a lot easier, which in turn then makes, the political appeal to allowing more refugees or allowing generally more status and support to be an easier ask.
So every situation is different. You have a conflict, people flee, usually to a neighboring country. And the situation, like you just explained with Colombia and Venezuela, it was super well received and unique, and they could integrate. So they didn't have camps. They didn't have, I'm sure it's still very, very difficult, but like there was that integration almost immediately. Similar, it sounds like, to Ukraine and Poland. Poland receives 18 months. You can work. You can kind of rebuild your life, at least for that time being. What is the process if someone flees and then does end up in a camp, which 20 years is mind-blowing, but like at that point, are they pretty much just applying for whatever country will take them? And it's like, okay, US takes this many a year, and I'm going to try to get a part of that number. And then this country takes this many a year. And then they're just applying wherever will be available. Because obviously, in theory, that would be better than being in a camp long-term. And then they're just waiting. Is that kind of what that process looks like?
Short answer is yes. The messy answer is it's really messy. And in that answer, actually, I want to highlight access to information as something that's really important. I think there's an undercurrent here that in the last 5 years has changed because we all have smartphones and they're all accessible. And so there's an idea of, is the internet a right? Because in my mind, it's access to information. And so when you think about in these specific scenarios, someone who has, again, my experience was in Greece with the Syrian crises, but at one point in the one camp I was in, there was 17 nationalities represented. Wow. And the way that the legal system in Greece was that when you arrive in Greece, you're applying for asylum in Greece, and they're accepting you. And yes, maybe after you receive asylum, you can apply to move somewhere else. So maybe somewhere else in the EU, or at a similar time, you could actually apply to go to a different country, like the United States, for example. I ran into a family that was from Afghanistan that actually supported our military in some way. I think they worked in some kind of logistics or translation capacity, and they had to flee because their life was at stake after our military presence was diminished at the time. It was while we were still working there. And essentially they had to leave, but they hadn't yet received status to go to the United States, approval through our refugee system. And so they had to go wait somewhere. And so they ended up in Greece because there was camps and they could have access to something. And so at the time, of course, they do have to apply to Greece, but they're also applying to additional countries and who have their own systems, right? So for this individual who had actually worked for the US military, they were applying through the special visas that we were, allowing for Afghanis, but they couldn't live in their home country. But they don't ever necessarily have status to live anywhere else, right? So then you have to go through a visa process to be anywhere else. And so they actually ended up in Greece and we're waiting there. And so it does get really complicated and each situation is so unique. I think Europe especially has been, and the EU and their response to migrants, both in Spain, Italy, Greece, coming from the Middle East and Africa has been different in every scenario and is based on the country that you enter, the political climate of that country, and the political climate of that country, and how they respond to your nationality. Right. So a Syrian is responded to different than someone maybe from Congo or from Libya. And in my perspective, anyone who's fleeing violence and war should receive the same level of care. But the reality in our system is that that's not true. And so when you think about what does the process actually look like, every individual who's going through this process has to sort of figure it out for themselves. And that's why I highlighted access to information, is because where do we find information? Well, we start Googling, right? And so we go through and we see, what are the options for me? What does this look like for my particular circumstances? What information do I need to find out? What information do I need to provide? For example, something we sometimes do, even in the US, when we're looking at refugees and who we accept, it's like a 2-year process, I think. And we actually look for proof that someone's life is at stake. And so it can be, people will save WhatsApp chats or videos that they have of bombings in their homes, which, is tragic that they have to do that. But I think it also highlights the individual nature of the process. And it's one of the reasons the process takes so long. And not only in the United States, but in many countries, is because it really is individualized. Now, a direct contrast to that is actually Poland, and the way that they have received Ukrainian refugees is essentially when the violence and conflict started on February 24, there was an immediate response that was not individual. It said, you have 18 months, and you can register for a PESEL number is what they call it, for register for some kind of aid and services and register in Poland, but you don't necessarily need to. And so that asylum process, instead of saying, okay, wait at the border while we figure out our asylum process, they've been allowed to either integrate into society or build communities, or even have the flexibility to move back and forth across the border, which is really important as they stay connected not only to their home, but allows them possibility to go back to their country. Many people who leave don't want to. They want to go home when it's safe. But after you spend 20 years in a refugee camp, what do you have to go home to at that point? So I think it allows a better connection to be built. And even, many people have moved on past Poland into other countries, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Spain. Every country in Europe has essentially accepted Ukrainian refugees, and both, legally and in a system that can count them, but also on a very human to human basis, right? That they're allowed to be here. And so people can just say, hey, here's a room in my home. And so we don't actually track that information as well right now, because we just don't have the ability to. But I do think it highlights this ability and flexibility of people to respond to their individual circumstance in the best way that they can and maintain connections back home. While, yes, they're maybe still applying for asylum process, but movements are not restricted while the asylum seeking process occurs in Poland at this time, right? Versus the alternative where movements are restricted while the asylum seeking process occurs.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be a fascinating case study in a few years to see how it ends up. I mean, obviously, like you said, Colombia, Venezuela seems like a really unique and similar example. But yeah, that takes time. For the sake of time, I would love just for you kind of like, if you had a soapbox to speak to the American people, presuming that's mostly who's watching this, what are a few things that come to mind that you'd love people to know because of how commonly it's misconstrued or misinformation regarding refugee crisis, people coming to America with refugee status? What are some of your thoughts on that?
What are my thoughts on the refugee?
5 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes. Just share everything.
think that sometimes we sit in our homes in America and we say, wow, the Ukrainian crisis, like, how can I help? Wow, the Syrian crisis, how can I help? But your neighbors are probably immigrants. Your neighbors, a large, maybe not the majority, but a large portion of our communities originate in other countries. And actually, almost all of us originated in another country at some point in time. And I think that we forget that that experience is so close to us. And I think we forget to validate the experiences of others. Right. And so maybe me as a natural born American citizen from Dallas, Texas, born and raised, does not have the same experience as someone who comes over either as a refugee who has received asylum seeking, documentation, or as someone who comes over undocumented. And they come for a variety of reasons that I, barely can understand because I've never been in that situation. Right. And I think that we can't forget that these people are seeking safety and that there are neighbors that we care about and the people we see in the community every day. And maybe we don't know, about their specific stories, but I think we can empathize with them and also recognize that we cannot invalidate their experience, but we can listen to it and we can learn from it and maybe take a little bit of that into our daily lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful. And I sometimes wonder if it's helpful for us to consider that we're not immune to potentially being in that same boat sometime, I mean, anything can happen. So, do you have any final thoughts that you'd love to just throw out there? We want to keep this under wraps, for the sake of respecting time, but if you have any other final conclusions.
I'll add one thing. I've heard a lot sometimes in my work that how do you talk to these people like who have experienced so much? Like, how do you interact with them? Like what that must be really emotionally exhausting. And I'm sort of like, well, I interact with them like they're humans because they all have the same issues. They go through the same struggles as we all do. But I would actually really strongly recommend to anyone here to take a psychological first aid class. Now, that's something that helps you better relate to individuals who might be experiencing emotional crises. And also, just like you would go through a basic first aid class, like what to do in an emergency, this is what to do in an emotional emergency. And that's something that is so important, not only with this, group of affected people we're talking about, but in our daily lives, working with our friends, our coworkers, our peers. So go take a psychological first aid class.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I will find a few good links and put those in the show notes. And I mean, there you have it, folks. Like, I think the whole purpose of this campaign is everything that you just kind of heard, from the idea of understanding the world through more nuance and complexity, being able to approach someone with completely no lens, no bias, and just hearing, listening, approaching. They're a human. You're a human. So I love it. I love all that was said. So thanks so much, Natalie, for your time. And hopefully people learned something. I'm sure they did. And awesome. You're doing awesome work. So keep it up, and many blessings. And hopefully you continue to find your own peace so that you can keep doing the work in the service. So
thank you.
Yeah. Cheers, guys.
Get mad. Get mad, Priest Coffee.